The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September 1878, and Sarah Crawford held it in her trembling hands for a full 5 minutes before she found the courage to break the wax seal that would confirm what she already knew in her bones. Her father was dead. The words swam before her eyes as she stood in the cramped back room of the general store in Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, surrounded by crates of supplies that needed inventorying, ledgers that needed balancing, and 100 other tasks that never seemed to end. Samuel Crawford had passed 3 weeks prior in Denver, the lawyer wrote, from complications of pneumonia. The funeral had already taken place. There were matters of the estate to discuss, but those could wait. What couldn't wait was the store he'd left her, the one she'd been managing alone for the past 2 years while he'd chased some foolish dream of silver strikes in Colorado. Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it in her apron pocket. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in so long she wasn't sure she remembered how. Instead, she picked up her pencil and returned to the inventory list, her hand moving across the page in neat, precise strokes. Flour, sugar, coffee, tea, salt pork, dried beans. The words were familiar, comforting in their ordinariness. "Miss Crawford?" The voice of Tommy Henderson, her young clerk, broke through her concentration. "There's a gentleman here asking about bulk orders for a mining camp up in the mountains." Sarah set down her pencil and smoothed her dark hair, which she wore pulled back in a severe bun that gave her headaches by mid-afternoon. She was 24 years old, though most people guessed older. The past 2 years had carved lines around her eyes and mouth that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. The store's main room smelled of leather and tobacco, coffee, and sawdust. It was a smell Sarah had known her entire life, first in her father's store in Kansas, then here in Cheyenne when they'd moved west 5 years ago, chasing opportunity and running from debt. Now it was her smell, her store, her debt, her responsibility pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. The man waiting by the counter was not what she expected. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill half the store. His hair, dark brown and touched with auburn in the lamplight, fell past his collar in waves that suggested he hadn't seen a barber in months. He wore buckskin trousers and a heavy wool shirt that strained across his chest and arms, which were clearly muscled from hard labor. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of beard and eyes the color of pine trees in winter. "I'm Sarah Crawford," she said, keeping her voice level and professional. "How can I help you?" The man turned those green eyes on her, and she saw something flicker in them, surprise perhaps, or assessment. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his worn hat. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel rolling over stone. "Name's James Mackenzie. I run a timber operation up in the Medicine Bow Range, looking to place an order for supplies, substantial order." Sarah pulled out her order book, grateful for something concrete to focus on. "What do you need?" For the next 20 minutes, they went through lists. James Mackenzie knew exactly what he wanted and how much flour by the barrel, coffee by the pound, dried meat, beans, rice, sugar, salt, tools, rope, nails, lamp oil, and a dozen other necessities. Sarah wrote it all down, her pencil scratching across the page, her mind calculating costs and profit margins, even as she maintained a polite expression. "When do you need delivery?" she asked. 2 weeks. I'll send men down with wagons." He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. She didn't. "You look tired, madam, if you don't mind me saying." "I don't recall asking for personal observations, Mr. Mackenzie," Sarah said coolly, though something in her chest tightened. "Will that be all?" A slight smile touched his lips, softening the harsh planes of his face. "My apologies. Yes, that's all. How much do I owe for deposit?" They concluded the business transaction with brisk efficiency. James Mackenzie counted out silver dollars with hands that were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who knew hard work. Sarah wrote him a receipt in her neat script and handed it over. "Thank you, Miss Crawford," he said. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "You run this place alone?" "I have a clerk," she replied, gesturing to where Tommy was sweeping the far corner of the store. "That's not what I asked." Sarah met his eyes squarely. "Yes, Mr. Mackenzie. I run this place alone, as I have for 2 years. Is there something else you need, or shall I see you in 2 weeks?" He studied her for another long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through her carefully maintained composure to the exhaustion beneath. 2 weeks, he finally said, and left, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe. Sarah watched him go, then returned to her inventory with determined focus. She worked through lunch, as she always did, eating a piece of bread and cheese at her desk while reviewing accounts. The numbers swam before her eyes: income, expenses, debts, interest. The store was barely breaking even, and without her father's periodic infusions of cash from his mining ventures, which had apparently been less successful than he'd led her to believe, she was going to have trouble making the next payment to the bank. She worked until the sun set, and Tommy went home to his mother's supper. She worked by lamplight, going through ledgers, writing letters to suppliers, planning orders. At 9 o'clock, she climbed the narrow stairs to the small apartment above the store where she lived alone. She ate a cold supper of leftover stew, washed her face and hands in the basin, and fell into bed still wearing her chemise and petticoat because she was too tired to undress further. Sleep didn't come. It rarely did anymore. She lay in the darkness, her mind racing through lists and problems and worries. The bank payment, the roof that needed repairs, the shipment from St. Louis that was 3 weeks overdue, the letter from her father's lawyer that she hadn't had time to think about. Her father, who had left her with nothing but debt and responsibility and a building full of dry goods. At midnight, she gave up on sleep and went back downstairs to work on the books. This was how Sarah Crawford lived. This was all she knew anymore: work and worry, numbers and lists, one foot in front of the other through days that blurred into weeks that blurred into months. She couldn't remember the last time she'd taken a full day off, or gone for a walk just for the pleasure of it, or read a book that wasn't a ledger. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed, really laughed, or felt anything beyond the constant low hum of anxiety that had become her normal state. She'd forgotten how to rest. She had forgotten that rest was even possible. 2 weeks later, on a crisp October morning with frost on the ground and the aspens turning gold on the mountainsides, 3 wagons pulled up in front of Crawford's general store. James Mackenzie was driving the first one, with 2 other men handling the others, rough-looking fellows in canvas coats and battered hats. Sarah had the order ready, organized and inventoried. She directed Tommy and the men in loading the wagons, checking each item off her list with brisk efficiency. James Mackenzie watched her work with those observant green eyes, occasionally lifting a heavy barrel or crate with an ease that suggested the weight was nothing to him. "You're very organized, Miss Crawford," he observed when they were nearly finished. "Organization is essential in business, Mr. Mackenzie," she replied, not looking up from her clipboard. "James. Call me James. That would be inappropriate. We're doing business together. Seems friendly enough." Sarah finally looked at him. He stood with one hand resting on a wagon side, his posture relaxed despite the morning's hard work. The early sun caught in his dark hair and highlighted the strong line of his jaw. He was probably 30, she guessed, maybe 32. Old enough to have the confidence of experience, young enough to have the strength of his prime. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said firmly, "I prefer to keep business relationships professional." "Fair enough." He didn't seem offended. "Tell me, do you ever take a day off? Why does everyone keep asking me that?" The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with a frustration she hadn't meant to reveal. "Because you look like you haven't slept properly in a year, and there are shadows under your eyes dark enough to be bruises." His voice was gentle, without judgment. "Begging your pardon for saying so." Sarah's hand tightened on her clipboard. "My appearance is none of your concern. Your order is complete. That will be the balance we discussed, minus your deposit." James paid without argument, but as he was climbing back onto his wagon, he paused. "Miss Crawford, I've got a standing offer. If you ever need to get out of town for a day, come up to the camp. Fresh mountain air, pine forests, good clear streams. Might do you good. I have a business to run. Business will still be here when you get back." He tipped his hat. "Think about it." Then he was gone, the wagons rolling north out of town toward the mountains that rose like blue giants against the autumn sky. Sarah didn't think about it. She couldn't afford to think about it. She had a shipment to receive, accounts to reconcile, a meeting with the banker that she was dreading. The banker, Mr. Carlyle, was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a perpetual expression of disapproval. He looked at Sarah's ledgers with pursed lips and made small humming sounds that set her teeth on edge. Miss Crawford, I'm afraid these numbers are not encouraging, he said, tapping the page with one finger. Your income has been declining for 3 consecutive months. The railroad has brought more competition, Sarah explained, keeping her voice steady. Several new stores have opened, but I have loyal customers, and I'm working on expanding my supplier relationships to offer better prices. Nevertheless, there is the matter of the loan your father took out. The principal and interest come due in 6 months. That's a substantial sum. I'm aware of the amount, Mr. Carlyle. I'll have it. How? His eyes were cold behind his spectacles. Forgive me for being blunt, but your father made certain promises when he secured this loan. Promises about silver strikes and mining profits. Those profits have not materialized. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, a mixture of anger and humiliation. My father's ventures are separate from the store. The store is profitable and will continue to be so. I will make the payment on time. Mr. Carlyle looked at her for a long moment. I certainly hope so, Miss Crawford. The bank cannot extend further grace periods. We have our own obligations to consider. Sarah left the bank with her head high and her stomach churning. 6 months. She had 6 months to come up with more money than the store was likely to generate in a year, let alone while maintaining operating costs and paying her own living expenses. The situation was impossible. She worked harder. She opened the store earlier and closed it later. She took on consignment goods from local craftspeople, adding their wares to her inventory. She wrote letters to mining camps and ranches, soliciting bulk orders. She negotiated with suppliers, squeezing every penny out of her profit margins. November arrived with the first real snow. December brought bitter cold and shorter days. Sarah burned lamp oil late into every night, huddled at her desk with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, going through numbers until they blurred and ran together. She was drinking too much coffee and eating too little real food. She knew this. She couldn't seem to stop. On a Tuesday evening in mid-December, as she was preparing to close the store, James Mackenzie walked in. Sarah looked up from the counter where she was counting the day's receipts, and for a moment she couldn't quite process his presence. He seemed too large for the space, too vital, snowflakes melting in his dark hair and on the shoulders of his heavy coat. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, her voice coming out hoarse. She cleared her throat. "I wasn't expecting you." "Came down for supplies before the real winter sets in," he said. "Thought I'd check on that order personally rather than sending one of the men." He studied her with those disconcerting green eyes, and she saw concern flicker across his face. "Miss Crawford, when's the last time you ate?" "I had lunch," she lied. "When's the last time you ate a real meal and slept a full night?" Sarah set down her pen with a sharp click. "Mr. Mackenzie, I don't appreciate—" "You're shaking," he interrupted, his voice still gentle but firm. "And you're pale as milk. There's a cafe 3 doors down. Come have supper with me. I have work to do. It can wait an hour. You don't understand. I understand you're running yourself into the ground." He took a step closer, and she could smell pine and wood smoke on him, fresh air in winter. "1 meal, Miss Crawford. That's all I'm asking. Then you can come back and work yourself to death if that's what you're determined to do." Sarah opened her mouth to refuse again, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the counter for support, and suddenly James was there, his hand under her elbow, steadying her with a grip that was both strong and surprisingly gentle. "That's it," he said firmly. "You're eating, no arguments." She should have protested. She should have sent him away and returned to her ledgers. Instead, she found herself putting on her cloak and locking the store door and walking beside James Mackenzie through the snowy evening to Martha's Cafe, where warm lamplight glowed in the windows and the smell of roast chicken made her stomach clench with sudden, fierce hunger. James ordered for both of them, chicken, potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, apple pie. Sarah stared at the food when it arrived, suddenly ravenous. She ate without speaking, barely tasting the food, just shoveling it in like fuel. James ate more slowly, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Better?" he asked when she finally pushed back her plate. "Yes," Sarah admitted. The dizziness had faded, replaced by a pleasant warmth. "Thank you." "Tell me about your father." The question caught her off guard. "What about him?" "Tommy mentioned he passed recently. I'm sorry for your loss." Sarah looked down at her empty plate. He died in September. I barely knew him anymore. He'd been gone for 2 years, chasing silver strikes that never panned out. Bitterness crept into her voice. He left me with nothing but debt and a failing store. The store isn't failing, James said. You're keeping it alive through sheer force of will. That's not enough. I owe the bank more than I can possibly pay. I have 6 months. And then she stopped, horrified at herself. She never talked about this, never showed weakness. I'm sorry. This isn't appropriate conversation. Why not? Because you're a customer and I barely know you and I don't, her voice caught. I don't talk about these things. Maybe that's part of the problem, James said quietly. You're carrying all of this alone. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been holding tight for too long. To her horror, tears began sliding down her cheeks. She wiped at them furiously, but they kept coming, silent and hot. James didn't say anything. He simply reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her cold fingers, and held on while she cried. When the storm finally passed, Sarah felt hollowed out and exhausted. She pulled her hand back, embarrassed. I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me. You're tired, James said. Bone tired, the kind of tired that sleep alone won't fix. I don't have the luxury of being tired. Everyone has that right. It's not a luxury, it's a necessity. He leaned back in his chair, considering her. I'm going to make you an offer, and I want you to actually think about it before you say no. Mr. Mackenzie, come up to the camp for Christmas. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Get away from the store, from the town, from all of this. Just rest. That's impossible. I can't just abandon my business. Tommy's a smart kid. He can handle things for a couple weeks, especially during the slow season. Most folks are hunkered down for winter anyway. I barely know you. Why would you even suggest such a thing? James was quiet for a moment, his green eyes steady on hers. Because I know what it's like to work yourself until there's nothing left. I did it for years after my wife died. Just kept cutting timber and building and working until I couldn't feel anything anymore. Nearly killed myself 6 times because I was too tired to be careful. He paused. It took a friend sitting me down and telling me I needed to stop, needed to breathe, needed to remember I was human. I'm returning the favor. Your wife died? Sarah's voice was soft. 4 years ago. Cholera. We'd only been married 2 years. Pain flickered across his face, old but still present. I understand loss, Miss Crawford, and I understand the temptation to just keep moving so you don't have to feel it. Sarah looked at this man, this near stranger who seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed walls. Why do you care? Honestly, a slight smile touched his lips. I'm not entirely sure, but I do. Maybe it's because I see myself in you, or maybe it's because someone should care, and it doesn't seem like anyone else is doing the job. He stood, dropping coins on the table for the meal. Think about it. If you decide to come, send word. I'll send someone down to fetch you. He left her sitting there in the warm cafe, staring after him with her mind spinning. Sarah didn't send word. Instead, she threw herself back into work with renewed determination. If she could just make it through the holidays, if she could just get a few good orders in the new year, if she could just work a little harder, sleep a little less, squeeze a few more pennies out of every transaction. But her body had other ideas. On December 20th, Sarah woke up and couldn't get out of bed, not because she was being lazy, but because her limbs literally wouldn't obey her. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding with panic. She had to open the store. She had deliveries to receive. She had customers depending on her. She couldn't move. Tommy found her an hour later when he came to open up, and she didn't answer his knock. The young man took one look at her and ran for the doctor. Dr. Bennett was a gruff, practical man in his 50s who had seen every variety of frontier ailment. He examined Sarah thoroughly while she lay in her bed, feeling like a helpless child. Then sat back with a sigh. Miss Crawford, your body has given up, he said bluntly. You've pushed it too hard for too long, and now it's refusing to cooperate. This is complete exhaustion. You need rest, real rest, not just a few hours of tossing and turning while your mind races. You need food, regular meals, and you need to stop working for at least a month. A month? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. That's impossible. The alternative is worse. Keep going like this and you'll collapse completely. Maybe have a breakdown you won't recover from. You're 24 years old. You should have decades ahead of you. Don't throw them away on a store. The store's all I have. Doctor. Bennett looked at her with something like pity. Then you're poorer than you realize. He stood, collecting his bag. I'm going to have Mrs. Henderson bring you meals. You're to stay in bed for at least 3 days. After that, we'll see if you can manage light activity. But no work, Miss Crawford. I mean it. He left her there, alone in the silence of her small apartment, with nothing to do but stare at the ceiling and feel the panic rising in her chest like floodwater. Tommy managed the store. Mrs. Henderson, his mother, brought meals that Sarah picked at without appetite. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah's mind raced in circles, worrying, planning, catastrophizing. On the second day, she tried to get up and go downstairs, but her legs gave out halfway down the stairs and she had to crawl back up, humiliated and frightened. On the third day, James Mackenzie came. Sarah heard his voice downstairs, speaking with Tommy in that deep, rough rumble. Then, footsteps on the stairs, and Tommy appeared in her doorway looking apologetic. Sorry, Miss Crawford, but Mr. Mackenzie insists on seeing you. I told him you weren't receiving visitors, but he's pretty determined. Before Sarah could respond, James filled the doorway, ducking under the frame. He took one look at her, pale and shaking, wrapped in a quilt in the chair by the window where she'd been trying to pretend she was fine, and his jaw tightened. Tommy, go pack a bag for Miss Crawford. Warm clothes, practical things, enough for a month. What are you doing? Sarah demanded, but her voice had no strength behind it. What someone should have done weeks ago. James crossed to where she sat and knelt down so his eyes were level with hers. You're coming up to the camp. You're going to rest, eat real food, and remember what it's like to be something other than a workhorse. And before you argue, know that I've already spoken to Tommy and his mother. They're going to manage the store. I've paid them in advance from my own pocket. Everything is arranged. You can't just, I can and I am. His voice was gentle but implacable. Sarah, you're dying by inches. I'm not going to stand by and watch it happen. It was the first time he'd used her given name. The intimacy of it, combined with the genuine concern in his eyes, broke through her last defenses. She was so tired, so incredibly, overwhelmingly tired. I don't understand why you're doing this, she whispered, because someone needs to. He stood, then carefully scooped her up in his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. She should have protested, should have insisted she could walk. But instead, she found herself resting her head against his broad chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart through his shirt, and letting someone else be strong for the first time in longer than she could remember. James carried her down the stairs and out to a wagon that waited in the street, fitted with a mattress and piled with blankets and furs. He settled her in gently, tucking the furs around her. It's about a 4-hour drive, he said. Try to sleep. Sarah didn't think she would, but the motion of the wagon, the fresh cold air, the simple relief of not having to be in charge, it all conspired to pull her down into darkness. She slept. She woke to the smell of pine and wood smoke. The wagon had stopped in a clearing surrounded by towering evergreens, their branches heavy with snow. A cluster of log buildings stood arranged around a central lodge, smoke rising from stone chimneys. The Medicine Bow Mountains rose all around, white peaks against a blue sky so clear and bright it almost hurt to look at. Welcome to Mackenzie Camp, James said, appearing at the back of the wagon. Can you walk or should I carry you? Sarah tried to stand and nearly fell. James caught her easily, then swung her back up into his arms. Carrying it is, he said with a slight smile. He took her into the main lodge, a sturdy building with thick log walls and large windows that let in floods of winter sunlight. Inside was a large common room with a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture worn smooth with use, and bookshelves lined with volumes. James carried her through to a smaller room off the main space where a bed stood covered in quilts, with a window looking out at the forest. This is my room, he said, settling her on the bed. You'll stay here. I'll bunk with the men. I can't take your room. You can and you will. He pulled the quilts up over her. Sleep now. We'll talk later. Sarah wanted to protest, to argue, to maintain some shred of independence, but the bed was soft, the room was warm, and exhaustion dragged at her like an undertow. She closed her eyes and fell into sleep so deep it felt like drowning. When she woke, the room was dim with evening light. Someone James, she assumed, had left a tray on the bedside table with bread, cheese, dried apples, and water. Sarah ate slowly, tasting the food properly for the first time in months. Then she slept again. This pattern continued for days. Sarah would wake, eat whatever James had left for her, perhaps sit up and look out the window at the snow-covered forest, then sleep again. Sometimes she slept for hours, sometimes for what felt like minutes before exhaustion pulled her back down. Her body was making up for months of deprivation, and James simply let it happen. He didn't push her, didn't demand conversation or activity. He would appear 2 or 3 times a day with food or to build up the fire, would ask if she needed anything, and would leave when she said no. On the 5th day, Sarah woke feeling different. The crushing fatigue had lifted slightly, enough that she felt she could actually get out of bed without collapsing. She stood carefully, testing her legs, then made her way to the window. The view stole her breath. The forest stretched out in all directions, pristine and white, the trees dark green against the snow. A stream ran through the clearing, not frozen despite the cold, its water rushing over rocks in a constant musical burble. The sky was that deep blue that only comes with winter in the mountains, and the air, even through the closed window, she could tell it was different from town air, cleaner, sharper. It made her want to breathe deeply. "Beautiful, isn't it?" James's voice came from the doorway. Sarah turned. He stood there in worn canvas trousers and a flannel shirt, his dark hair pulled back, his green eyes warm in the lamplight. He looked completely at home in this wild place, part of it somehow. "It's unlike anything I've ever seen," she admitted. "You're looking better, more color in your cheeks." He came into the room, keeping a respectful distance. "Think you could manage to come sit by the fire for a bit? Change of scenery might do you good." Sarah nodded. She was wearing a nightgown that Mrs. Henderson must have packed, with one of her shawls wrapped around her shoulders. It wasn't exactly proper, but then none of this was proper. She was alone in the mountains with a man she barely knew, sleeping in his bed while he cared for her like she was something precious. The whole situation was scandalous by any measure. She found she didn't care. James led her to the main room where a fire crackled in the huge stone fireplace. He'd set a chair there with cushions and blankets, positioned to catch the fire's warmth. Sarah sank into it gratefully, and James covered her with a heavy quilt. "Coffee?" he offered. "Please." He brought her coffee in a tin cup, strong and hot and sweetened with sugar. Sarah wrapped her hands around it and let the warmth seep into her fingers. "Where are your men?" she asked, realizing the lodge was silent except for the fire's crackle and the wind outside. "Most of them went home for the winter. We shut down operations when the real snow sets in. Just me and old Pete left, and he's in the bunkhouse, probably half deaf from sawing so much timber over the years." James settled into a chair across from her, his long legs stretched out toward the fire. "It's quiet this time of year. Good time for resting." "You really do understand," Sarah said softly. "I told you I did." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire. Sarah felt something loosening in her chest, some tight knot of tension she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. The silence wasn't awkward or demanding. It was just peaceful. "Thank you," she said after a while, "for this, for forcing me to accept help I didn't know I needed." "You're welcome." James looked at her with those steady green eyes. "How long since you felt like you could just sit and do nothing?" Sarah thought about it. "Years. Even before my father left, there was always something to do, some crisis to manage, some problem to solve. And after he left," she trailed off. "It got worse. I was alone and everything depended on me, and if I stopped for even a moment, everything would fall apart." "Did it fall apart while you've been here?" "I don't know. Probably. Want to bet it didn't? That Tommy and his mother are handling things just fine, and the world kept turning without you holding it up?" Sarah smiled slightly. "That's not a bet I want to make. If I lose, I have to admit I'm not as indispensable as I thought. If I win, my store is in ruins. So maybe the answer is to not think about it at all for a while." James stood and added another log to the fire, his movements economical and sure. "You've got weeks here. Let someone else carry the weight." Over the next days, Sarah began to emerge from her cocoon of exhaustion. She started joining James for meals at the large table in the main room, simple, hearty food that Pete cooked in the lodge kitchen. Venison stew, fresh bread, roasted vegetables, thick soups. Sarah ate and felt strength returning to her body. She began taking short walks around the clearing, bundled in a heavy coat James loaned her that hung to her knees and smelled of him pine and leather and wood smoke. The cold air burned her lungs in a good way, making her feel alive. She would walk to the stream and watch the water rush over the rocks, crystalline and eternal, and feel her mind beginning to quiet. James was always nearby but never intrusive. He worked on equipment repairs in one of the outbuildings, or read by the fire, or carved small pieces of wood into delicate shapes, birds, deer, flowers. He moved through his days with a calm competence that Sarah found mesmerizing. There was no rushing, no panic, no desperate scrambling to keep up with impossible demands, just steady, purposeful living. They began to talk in the evenings, long conversations by the fire while the winter wind howled outside and the flames danced shadows across the walls. James told her about growing up in Pennsylvania, learning the timber trade from his father, coming west after his wife died, because he couldn't bear to stay in the place that reminded him of her. Her name was Elizabeth, he said one night, his voice soft. She was small and fierce, with red hair and a laugh like bells. She wanted adventure, wanted to see the frontier. We came out here together, full of dreams. He stared into the fire. When she died, I wanted to die too. I worked like a madman, taking stupid risks, not caring if I lived or saw another sunrise. Then one day I was up a tree, cutting, and I slipped. Fell 30 feet and landed in a snowbank. Should have broken my neck. Instead, I just lay there looking up at the sky, and I thought Elizabeth would be furious with me for wasting the life she lost. So you changed, Sarah said quietly. So I changed. I learned to work hard, but not destructively. Learned the difference between productivity and self-punishment. Learned to sit still and breathe and notice that life was still happening around me, still beautiful, still worth living. He looked at her. I see that same destructiveness in you, that same running from grief and fear by working yourself to death. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know how to stop. You're stopping right now. You've been stopped for over a week. It feels wrong, like I'm being lazy, irresponsible. Does it feel wrong, really? Or does it feel terrifying because you're not in control? Sarah considered this. Both, she admitted. I'm so used to being the one holding everything together. If I let go, even for a moment, everything falls apart, James finished, except it doesn't. It hasn't. The world is managing without you just fine. It was a hard truth, but Sarah was beginning to believe it. Tommy had sent one message via a writer letting her know the store was operating smoothly and she wasn't to worry. The message had been both a relief and strangely painful proof that she wasn't as necessary as she'd believed. Christmas came to the mountain. James cut a small pine tree and set it up in the lodge, and Sarah found herself decorating it with strung popcorn and small carved ornaments that James produced from a box. It was simple, rustic, nothing like the elaborate Christmases she remembered from childhood, but it filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. On Christmas Eve, James roasted a wild turkey that Pete had shot, and they ate by candlelight with snow falling softly outside the windows. After dinner, James pulled out a battered fiddle and played carols, his fingers surprisingly nimble on the strings. Sarah sang along, her voice rusty from disuse, but growing stronger. You have a beautiful voice, James said when they finished Silent Night. I used to sing all the time, Sarah said, surprised by the memory. Before everything got so hard, I'd forgotten. What else did you forget? Sarah thought about it. I used to read for pleasure. I loved novels, adventures, poetry. I haven't read anything but ledgers and invoices in 2 years. She laughed, a real laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep. I used to take long walks and notice things, birds, flowers, clouds. I used to sketch sometimes. I wasn't very good, but I enjoyed it. Who were you, Sarah Crawford, before you became a human machine? The question struck something deep in her chest. I was someone who laughed easily. Someone who saw possibilities instead of just problems. Someone who believed good things could happen. Her voice caught. I want to be that person again. James set down the fiddle and came to sit beside her on the long sofa. He didn't touch her, but she could feel his warmth, his solid presence. You can be. It's not too late. You're 24 years old with your whole life ahead of you. A life that includes a failing store and impossible debt. Maybe. Or maybe you make different choices. Sell the store, start over somewhere else, do something completely different. The store is all I have. My father built it. It's my responsibility. Your father left you with debt and disappeared to chase foolish dreams, James said bluntly. Why do you owe him your whole life? Sarah stared at him, shocked. No one had ever said it so plainly. Because he was my father. And? That means you sacrifice yourself on the altar of his bad decisions? You don't understand. I understand perfectly. I understand duty and loyalty and obligation. I also understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go of what's killing you and choose life instead. He turned to face her fully, his green eyes intense. What do you want, Sarah? Not what you should want or what you think you're supposed to want. What do you actually want? No one had asked her that in years, maybe ever. Sarah opened her mouth to give some responsible answer, but what came out was the truth. I want to breathe. I want to wake up without my chest tight with anxiety. I want to read books and take walks and sing. I want to feel like my life is mine, not just an endless treadmill of obligations. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I want to feel alive again. Then do it, James said simply. It's not that easy. It's exactly that easy. It's also the hardest thing you'll ever do, but Sarah, you're halfway there already. You've been here almost 3 weeks, and you've remembered how to rest. You've remembered how to just be. That's the first step. Sarah looked at this man who had basically kidnapped her for her own good, who had fed her and sheltered her and asked for nothing in return, who looked at her like she was someone worth saving. Something shifted in her chest, something that felt like the first crack in a dam. I'm afraid, she whispered. I know. James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, strong and steady. But you don't have to be afraid alone. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, watching the fire burn down to embers. Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope. The days after Christmas blurred into a peaceful routine. Sarah woke when her body was ready, not to an alarm or obligation. She ate breakfast with James and Pete, helped with small tasks around the lodge, washing dishes, organizing supplies, but never to the point of exhaustion. She took long walks in the forest, discovering how the snow muffled sound and made the world feel hushed and sacred. She found James's small collection of books and began reading again, losing herself in stories. And she spent time with James, long hours by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about the timber business, his plans to expand sustainably, his love for these mountains. She told him about her childhood in Kansas, her mother who had died when Sarah was 12, her dreams of adventure that had gotten lost somewhere along the way. She noticed things about him, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentleness in his huge, scarred hands when he carved his little wooden figures. The way he moved through the world with such quiet confidence, like he knew exactly who he was and made no apologies for it. The breadth of his shoulders and the strength in his arms, which he demonstrated by lifting a fallen tree trunk off the path one day with apparently little effort, his muscles straining against his shirt in a way that made Sarah's mouth go dry. She was attracted to him. The realization came one morning as she watched him chopping wood outside, his breath steaming in the cold air, his body moving with efficient power. It had been so long since she'd felt anything like desire that it took her a moment to recognize it. When she did, heat flooded her face. She was falling in love with James Mackenzie. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely inappropriate. She'd known him barely a month. He was 11 years older than her. He'd loved his wife deeply and probably still mourned her. And Sarah was a mess, a broken thing he'd taken pity on. But her heart didn't care about logic. It only knew that when James looked at her, she felt seen in a way she'd never experienced. When he smiled at something she said, warmth bloomed in her chest. When his hand brushed hers accidentally, electricity raced up her arm. She tried to hide it, but she suspected she wasn't very successful. James had a way of watching her with those perceptive green eyes that suggested he saw far more than she wanted to reveal. One afternoon in early January, nearly a month into her stay, Sarah was reading by the fire when James came in from outside, snowflakes melting in his dark hair. "Come with me," he said. "I want to show you something." Sarah set down her book and pulled on her borrowed coat. James led her through the forest on a path she hadn't explored before, the snow crunching under their boots. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes, climbing gradually, until they emerged onto a rocky outcropping that looked out over the entire valley. The view was breathtaking. The Medicine Bow Range spread out in all directions, white peaks against blue sky, with the forest rolling away below in dark green waves. The sun was beginning to set, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. "This is my favorite place," James said softly. "I come here when I need to think, to remember what's important." "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed. "You're beautiful." The words were so quiet she almost didn't hear them. She turned to find James looking at her, not at the view, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. "Chid, I'm sorry," he said quickly. "That was inappropriate. You're here as my guest, under my protection. I shouldn't have. Don't apologize." Sarah's heart was pounding. "Please don't apologize." James studied her face. "Sarah, I need to be honest with you. These past weeks, getting to know you, watching you heal and come back to life, it's been one of the best experiences of my life. You're smart and strong and brave, even when you don't feel like it. You have a way of looking at the world that makes me see things differently. And somewhere along the way, I started falling for you." Sarah couldn't breathe. "You did?" "I did, I am." He took a step closer. "But I need you to know I'm not trying to take advantage. You're vulnerable right now, healing, and the last thing I want is to pressure you or confuse gratitude with something else. If all you feel for me is friendship, or if you're not ready for anything more, I'll respect that completely. You'll always have a place here. Always be welcome, with no expectations." Sarah looked at this good, honorable man who had saved her life without asking for anything in return, and felt her last walls crumbling. "What if I'm falling for you too?" she whispered. James's breath caught. "Are you?" "Yes." The word came out stronger than she expected. "I didn't want to. I tried not to. But James, you've shown me what life could be like. You've given me back pieces of myself I thought were lost forever. You've sat with me in silence until I remembered how to rest, and then you've helped me remember how to live. How could I not fall in love with you?" Sarah. Her name was a prayer on his lips. He reached up slowly and cupped her face in his large, rough hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "May I kiss you? Please." He lowered his mouth to hers, and Sarah felt herself catching fire. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, giving her time to pull away. She didn't pull away. Instead, she pressed closer, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, feeling the solid muscle beneath his coat. James made a sound low in his throat and deepened the kiss, his arms coming around her and pulling her against his broad chest. Sarah had been kissed before, awkward fumbling attempts from boys in Kansas. This was nothing like that. This was earth-shaking, soul-deep, the kind of kiss that changed everything. James kissed her like she was precious, like she was essential, like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah rested her forehead against his chest and felt his heart hammering. "I love you," James said, his voice rough. "I know it's fast, I know it's probably crazy, but I love you, Sarah Crawford." "I love you too," Sarah said, and felt the truth of it resonate through her entire body. They stood there on the mountain as the sun set around them, holding each other, and Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Complete peace. That night, they sat by the fire and talked about the future carefully, tentatively, but with growing excitement. James wanted to build his timber operation into something sustainable, a business that worked with the forest rather than just exploiting it. He had land, resources, a good reputation with the other camps and mills. Sarah found herself imagining a different life, not running herself into the ground over a store she'd never wanted, but building something new with this man who made her feel alive. Maybe she could sell the store, pay off the debts, and start fresh. Maybe she could breathe. "What would you do if you weren't running a store?" James asked. Sarah thought about it. I always loved organizing things, making systems work better, and I'm good with numbers and planning. Maybe I could help you with the business side of the timber operation. Maybe we could expand together, build something real." "I'd like that," James said softly. "I'd like that very much." Over the next weeks, they talked through practicalities. James admitted that his operation could use better organization and financial management. He was good with the timber itself, but less skilled with the business details. Sarah's mind came alive with possibilities, seeing inefficiencies she could streamline, opportunities he was missing. But more than that, they simply enjoyed each other. They took long walks through the winter forest. They cooked meals together, moving around the kitchen in an easy rhythm. They read books aloud to each other by the fire. They talked until late at night, discovering each other's stories and dreams and fears. And they kissed. A lot. Sweet kisses, passionate kisses, kisses that left Sarah dizzy and wanting more. James was always respectful, never pushing further than she was ready for, but the desire between them was a living thing, growing stronger each day. "I want to marry you," James said one evening as they sat by the fire. "But I know it's too soon. I know you need time to settle things in town to be sure this is what you want." "It is what I want," Sarah said. "But you're right, I need to go back, face things, make proper decisions rather than running away. I need to sell the store properly, settle my father's debts, close that chapter of my life." "I'll come with you." "You don't have to, Sarah, I'm not letting you face that alone. Not anymore." His jaw was set in a way she was learning meant he wouldn't be moved. "We'll go back together, we'll handle it together, and then, if you still want me, we'll build a life together." Sarah kissed him for that, pouring all her gratitude and love into it. They returned to Cheyenne in mid-February. The town looked different to Sarah's eyes, smaller, dirtier, more confining than she remembered. But she walked into her store with her head high, James at her side. Tommy and Mrs. Henderson had indeed managed beautifully. The store was running smoothly, inventory was organized, and there was even a small profit from the quiet winter months. They'd done everything she would have done, proving what Sarah had suspected. She was not indispensable. "You look wonderful, Miss Crawford," Mrs. Henderson said, beaming. "Like a different person." "I feel like a different person," Sarah admitted. "Thank you for taking care of things. I couldn't have done this without you." Over the next month, Sarah made her plans. She put the store up for sale, not desperately but properly, at a fair price. Several people expressed interest, including a young couple new to town who had retail experience and big dreams. Sarah negotiated calmly, without the panic that would have consumed her months ago. She met with her father's lawyer and went through the estate. There wasn't much. Samuel Crawford had died with more debts than assets, but there was enough, combined with the store sale, to pay off what was owed to the bank. Mr. Carlyle was surprised when Sarah walked into his office with a bank draft for the full amount of the loan, paid in full with interest. "I must say, Miss Crawford, I didn't expect this," he admitted. "Neither did I," Sarah said. "But it turns out that when you stop drowning, you can actually see the shore." She signed the papers, watched him mark the loan as satisfied, and walked out of the bank a free woman. No debt, no crushing obligations, just possibility. James was waiting outside, leaning against a post, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He straightened when he saw her, and the smile that crossed his face made her heart skip. "Done?" he asked. Done. How does it feel?" Sarah took a deep breath of spring air because it was spring now, the snow melting, green things starting to push up through the mud. "It feels like being born again." James pulled her into his arms right there on the street, and Sarah didn't care who saw. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him, joy bubbling through her veins. They were married in April in a small ceremony at the church in Cheyenne, with Tommy and Mrs. Henderson and a handful of friends as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple dress of pale blue wool, and James wore his best suit, which strained slightly across his shoulders, but made him look devastatingly handsome. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, James kissed her with such tender passion that several ladies in the congregation fanned themselves. They honeymooned at the mountain camp, now Sarah's home. She'd sold everything from the store except her most precious possessions, her mother's china. A few books, some photographs, everything else was left behind, including the woman she'd been. The timber operation became their joint project. Sarah threw herself into organizing the business side, creating proper accounting systems, negotiating better contracts with mills, finding new markets for their lumber. She was good at it, and more importantly, she enjoyed it. The challenge was stimulating without being crushing, and she could step away at the end of the day and just be Sarah, not a human machine. James taught her about the forest, how to read the trees and know which ones to cut and which to leave, how to replant and manage sustainably. She loved watching him work, his powerful body moving with practiced ease as he directed operations. At night, they would return to the lodge and make love in the big bed, and Sarah discovered pleasures she'd never imagined, her body coming alive under James's skilled, gentle hands. Life fell into a rhythm that was productive without being destructive. They worked hard during the day, but in the evenings they rested. They read together, talked, made love, simply existed in each other's presence. Sarah found herself laughing easily again, seeing beauty in the world, feeling hope instead of dread. Pete became a beloved fixture in their lives, a gruff grandfather figure who taught Sarah to cook game and told outrageous stories about his younger days. The timber crew, when they returned in spring, accepted Sarah immediately, appreciating her organizational skills and the way she made the whole operation run more smoothly. In August, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She told James one evening as they sat on the porch of the lodge watching the sun set over the mountains. "You're going to be a father," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. James's face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, fear, wonder. "Sarah," he breathed, "are you sure? Dr. Bennett confirmed it yesterday when I went into town." James pulled her into his arms and held her like she was made of glass. "I'm going to be a father," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy?" James laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Sarah, I'm more than happy. I'm blessed, honored, terrified, overwhelmed, all of it." The pregnancy was not easy. Sarah was sick for the first 3 months, exhausted for the next 3, and uncomfortable for the final trimester. But James was patient and attentive, bringing her tea when she was nauseous, rubbing her swollen feet, holding her when she cried from hormones or fear. Their son was born in March of 1880, during a late winter storm that dumped 2 feet of snow on the mountains. Dr. Bennett had come up to the camp a week early, not wanting to risk being unable to reach them when the time came. The labor was long and difficult, 18 hours of pain that left Sarah exhausted and James white-faced with fear. But when the baby finally emerged, red-faced and screaming, perfect and healthy, Sarah felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "He's beautiful," James whispered, tears running down his face as he held his son for the first time. "He looks like you." "He has your eyes," Sarah said, seeing green where she'd expected brown. They named him Samuel James, after both their fathers. Little Sam was a quiet baby, content to watch the world with those serious green eyes. Sarah discovered reserves of patience she hadn't known she possessed, and James was a devoted father, holding his son with the same careful gentleness he showed when carving his wooden figures. Life continued, full and rich. The timber business prospered under their combined management. They built a larger house, a proper home with multiple bedrooms and a big kitchen and windows that looked out at the forest from every angle. They hired staff to help with operations, including a woman named Martha who became cook and housekeeper and dear friend. Sarah's second pregnancy, 2 years after Sam, was easier. Their daughter Catherine arrived quickly and loudly, a red-faced bundle of fury with dark hair like her mother. Sarah held her new daughter and thought about the woman she'd been, the exhausted, broken creature who couldn't remember how to rest. That woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, happier, more whole, someone who'd learned that rest wasn't weakness but wisdom, someone who'd learned to accept help, to lean on others, to let herself be loved. Sam grew into a sturdy boy with his father's strength and his mother's quick mind. Catherine was fierce and fearless, climbing trees almost before she could walk. They were joined by 2 more children over the years, Michael and Emma, spaced 3 years apart. The lodge became a home filled with laughter and noise and life. Sarah taught her children to read, to love books and learning. James taught them to respect the forest, to work hard but not destructively. Together, they created a family built on love and mutual respect, and the knowledge that rest was as important as work. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James and Sarah took a trip, their first real time alone since Sam was born. Martha and her husband watched the children, and James took Sarah back to the rocky outcropping where he'd first told her he loved her. 10 years, he said, holding her hand as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in gold. Best 10 years of my life. Mine too, Sarah said softly. Do you remember what I was like when we met? I remember a woman who'd forgotten how to rest, who'd worked herself nearly to death trying to hold up a world that didn't need holding. And you sat with me in silence until I remembered how. You did the hard part, James said. You chose to change, to let go, to live instead of just survive. Sarah leaned against his broad chest, feeling his strong arms come around her. I chose you. Best choice either of us ever made. They stood there as the sun set, two people who'd found each other in the wilderness and built a life of meaning and love and balance. Sarah thought about the store in Cheyenne, which she'd heard had prospered under its new owners. She thought about the woman she'd been, running on empty, desperate, and alone. She felt gratitude for that woman, for her strength, her determination, her refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. But she didn't miss her. That woman had needed to learn to rest, to breathe, to trust. And a mountain man with gentle hands and patient eyes had sat with her in silence until she remembered how. The years continued to unfold with grace and challenge, triumph and struggle. The timber business grew, employing dozens of men from the surrounding areas. James developed innovative techniques for sustainable forestry that other operations began to adopt. Sarah's organizational genius and financial acumen made them prosperous without being greedy, successful without being destructive. Their children grew strong and healthy. Sam became a thoughtful young man with his father's love of the forest and his mother's analytical mind. He talked about studying forestry at university back east, then returning to expand the family business. Catherine was wild and artistic, sketching everything she saw and declaring she'd be a painter. Michael was the peacemaker, gentle and diplomatic, while Emma was pure sunshine, making everyone around her smile. Sarah sometimes volunteered at the school in the nearest town, teaching arithmetic and reading to children whose parents worked in the mines and mills. She found deep satisfaction in helping others learn, in watching understanding dawn in young eyes. James supported this completely, watching his children on the days she taught, proud of her gifts and her generosity. They faced hardships too. A forest fire in the summer of 1885 came within miles of their home, and they spent 3 terrifying days evacuating livestock and valuables while James and every able-bodied man fought to contain the blaze. They lost some timberland but saved the buildings and, more importantly, every human life. Sarah's brief return to panic during that crisis, the tightness in her chest, the racing thoughts, the urge to work herself into the ground, was met with James's steady presence. He held her hands and reminded her to breathe, sat with her in silence when words failed, anchored her until the storm passed. You're not alone anymore, he said simply. We carry this together. And they did. Pete passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1887 at the age of 78. They buried him on the mountain he'd loved, and Sarah wept for the gruff old man who'd helped teach her what family could look like. James carved a beautiful wooden marker, and the whole family visited the grave regularly, bringing flowers in summer and pine boughs in winter. Sarah's friendship with Martha deepened over the years. The two women would sit on the porch shelling peas or mending clothes, talking about everything and nothing. Martha had lost her own children, young to scarlet fever, and she poured her maternal love into Sarah's brood, becoming a second grandmother to them. You're good for him, you know, Martha said one day as they watched James teaching Sam and Michael to split logs. Mr. Mackenzie, he was half dead inside when I first came to work here, back before he found you, going through the motions but not really living. You brought him back to life. He did the same for me, Sarah said quietly. That's how the best marriages work. You save each other. On a cold November evening in 1890, Sarah and James sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed. Sarah was working on embroidering a sampler, a hobby she'd taken up recently, discovering she enjoyed the meditative quality of the stitching. James was reading, his spectacles perched on his nose. He'd turned 42 that year, and silver was threading through his dark hair, but he was still as strong as ever, his body hardened by years of physical labor. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked suddenly. James looked up from his book. "Regret what?" "This life. Marrying me. Taking on a broken woman and her problems." James set down his book and came to sit beside her on the sofa. He took the embroidery from her hands and set it aside, then took both her hands in his. "Sarah, I need you to listen very carefully. You were never broken. You were exhausted, overwhelmed, and trying to do the impossible alone. But you were never broken." His green eyes were intense. "And no, I've never regretted one single moment. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. You and our children, this life we've built, it's more than I ever dreamed possible. Even when I'm difficult? Especially then. Because you're real, Sarah. You're not perfect, and neither am I, and that's what makes this work. We're both human, both trying, both choosing each other every day." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I choose you every day too. Every single day." James kissed her then, slow and deep, and Sarah felt the familiar heat bloom in her belly. After 12 years of marriage, 4 children, and countless intimate moments, he could still make her feel like a young woman experiencing passion for the first time. They made love that night with the fire crackling and the winter wind howling outside, and afterward, Sarah lay in James's arms, feeling completely content. This life they'd built, it wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, still moments of stress or worry or fear. But she faced them with a partner, with a man who loved her fiercely and completely. And she'd learned to rest, to breathe, to know that her worth wasn't measured by how much she could accomplish or how hard she could work. She'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stop, be still, and let yourself be held until you remembered how to hold yourself. As the years rolled on, the Mackenzie family became a fixture in the Medicine Bow region. Their timber operation was known for fair wages, safe working conditions, and environmental stewardship. Other companies began adopting their methods, and James was occasionally invited to speak at forestry conferences in Denver or Cheyenne. Sarah accompanied him sometimes, leaving the children with Martha. She enjoyed these trips, the chance to see beyond their mountain haven, but she was always glad to return home. The lodge, the forest, the mountains, they'd become her sanctuary in a way the store in Cheyenne never had. In 1894, Sam left for university at age 14, brilliant enough to be accepted early to a forestry program in New York. Sarah cried when the train pulled away, but they were tears of pride mixed with sadness. Her boy was becoming a man, pursuing his dreams, and she and James had given him the foundation to do it. Catherine announced at 16 that she was going to study art in San Francisco. Michael wanted to be a doctor. Emma, still young, declared she was going to live in the forest forever and become a famous naturalist. "We raised them to be independent," James said one night as they discussed their children's various aspirations. "Can't complain when they actually become it." "I'm not complaining," Sarah said. "I'm just feeling time move. It goes so fast, James. I look at them and I still see babies, but they're becoming adults." "We've done well by them," James said firmly. "They're good people, all of them. Kind, hardworking, passionate about things that matter. That's more than most parents can say." Sarah knew he was right. Their children were growing into wonderful humans, each unique and special. She and James had worked hard to give them what neither of them had fully received from their own parents: unconditional love, support, and the freedom to pursue their own paths. In 1898, on a perfect June day with wildflowers blooming across the mountain meadows, Sam married a lovely young woman named Julia, whom he'd met at university. The wedding took place at the lodge, with family and friends gathered from across the territory. Sarah wore a dress of deep blue silk, and James looked distinguished in his formal suit, his hair now more silver than brown. As she watched her son pledge his life to his bride, Sarah felt James's hand find hers and squeeze. She looked up at her husband and saw tears in his eyes. 20 years, he whispered. "We've been married 20 years. "Best 20 years of my life," Sarah whispered back. "Mine too." The celebration lasted into the night, with music and dancing and laughter. Sarah danced with James under the stars, her head on his broad chest, and thought about how far they'd both come. Two broken people who'd found each other and learned to heal together, who'd built a life of purpose and love and meaning. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For saving me, for sitting with me in silence until I remembered how to rest, for loving me even when I didn't know how to love myself." James pulled back to look at her, his green eyes soft in the lamplight. "Sarah, you saved yourself. I just held space for you to do it, and you've saved me right back, every day since. That's what we do, we save each other." They danced until the stars wheeled overhead and the musicians grew tired. They celebrated their son's new beginning and their own enduring love. And when they finally retired to their room in the early hours of morning, they made love with the passion and tenderness of people who knew each other completely and chose each other still. Life continued its steady march. Catherine became a successful painter, her landscapes of the Rocky Mountains earning acclaim in galleries across the West. Michael completed medical school and opened a practice in Cheyenne, where he treated everyone regardless of their ability to pay. Emma did indeed become a naturalist, writing papers about mountain ecology and wildlife that were published in scientific journals. Sam and Julia took over more of the timber operation, bringing new energy and ideas while honoring the sustainable practices James had pioneered. They gave Sarah and James 3 grandchildren, 2 boys and a girl who spent summers at the mountain lodge learning to love the forest as their grandfather had taught their father. In 1905, Sarah turned 51 and James turned 57. They celebrated with a quiet dinner, just the two of them, in the home they'd built together. "We're getting old," Sarah observed, studying James's face across the table. His hair was completely silver now, and deep lines creased his weathered face. But to her, he was still the most handsome man she'd ever seen. "We're aging well," James corrected. "There's a difference." Sarah laughed. "Fair point. I suppose we've earned these wrinkles and gray hairs." "I've earned mine from worrying about you and the children," James teased. "And I've earned mine from putting up with you," Sarah shot back, eyes sparkling. They'd developed this comfortable banter over the years, a playfulness that kept their relationship fresh even after more than a quarter century together. They still made each other laugh, still surprised each other sometimes, still chose to nurture their love actively rather than taking it for granted. That night, as they prepared for bed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror. She saw a woman with silver threading through her dark hair, lines around her eyes and mouth, a body that had borne 4 children and lived 51 full years. She saw a woman who'd nearly destroyed herself with work and worry, who'd forgotten how to rest. And she saw a woman who'd been saved not by a man, not really, but by learning to be still, to breathe, to let herself be loved, and to love in return. James had created the space for that transformation, had sat with her in silence until she remembered how, but the work had been hers. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, coming to stand behind her. "I'm thinking about the woman I was when we met. How lost she was. How desperate." James wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "And look at you now, strong, happy, surrounded by family and love." "I never could have imagined this life back then," Sarah said softly. "When everything was falling apart and I couldn't see any way forward, I never dreamed I could be this happy." "Neither did I," James admitted. "After Elizabeth died, I thought that was it for me. One chance at love, gone forever. I never expected to find you." Sarah turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring 27 years of love and gratitude into it. They made love that night with the gentle passion of long familiarity, knowing each other's bodies as well as their own, understanding exactly how to bring pleasure and joy. The years continued to pass, each one precious. They watched their grandchildren grow, attended Catherine's art exhibitions and Michael's medical lectures, read Emma's published papers with pride. They worked less and rested more, taking long walks through the forest they both loved, sitting on the porch in comfortable silence, simply being together. In the summer of 1910, on their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the lodge for a celebration. The house was full of noise and laughter and life exactly as it should be. Sam stood to make a toast, his children clustered around him. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass. who showed all of us what real love looks like, who built a life and a business based on respect for each other and for the land, who taught us that success isn't measured in dollars but in relationships, in integrity, in living according to your values. He paused, emotion thick in his voice. You've given us the greatest gift parents can give. You've shown us how to love well. Thank you. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as everyone raised their glasses. She looked at James and saw his eyes were wet too. They'd built this family, this legacy, this love that would ripple through generations. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Sarah and James walked to their favorite spot on the rocky outcropping. The summer air was warm and sweet with the scent of pine. Stars blazed overhead in impossible profusion. For 30 years, Sarah said softly. Can you believe it? Feels like yesterday and forever all at once, James replied, pulling her close. If I could go back and tell that exhausted, desperate woman in Cheyenne what her life would become, she'd never believe me. Maybe that's why we don't get to know the future. We'd never believe the good things are possible. Sarah thought about this. It was true if someone had told her she'd find love, build a family, create a life of purpose and joy. She would have laughed bitterly. The future she'd seen then was just more of the same grinding struggle until she collapsed completely. I'm glad you kidnapped me, she said suddenly. James laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest where her head rested. I'm glad you let me. I didn't have much choice. I was too weak to fight back. You were never weak, Sarah. Exhausted, yes. Overwhelmed, absolutely. But never weak. It takes tremendous strength to accept help, to change, to choose a different path. They stood there under the stars, two people who'd grown old together, who'd weathered storms and celebrated joys, who'd built something lasting and true. I love you, Sarah said. Still, always. I love you too, James replied, until my last breath and beyond. As they walked back to the lodge hand in hand, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her, for this man, for this life, for the hard lessons that had brought her here. She'd forgotten how to rest, had nearly destroyed herself with work and worry and fear. But a mountain man with patient eyes and gentle hands had sat with her in silence until she remembered how. And in remembering how to rest, she'd learned how to truly live. The lodge came into view, warm light glowing from the windows, home in every sense of the word. Sarah squeezed James's hand and felt him squeeze back, a wordless communication they'd perfected over 3 decades together. They climbed the porch steps together as they'd done thousands of times before, and would do thousands of times more. Two souls who'd found each other in the wilderness and chosen love over fear, rest over endless striving, life over mere survival. And as they crossed the threshold into their home, Sarah sent up a silent prayer of thanks for the journey that had brought her here, for the man who walked beside her, and for the simple, profound gift of remembering how to rest. The door closed softly behind them, and the mountain night settled into peaceful stillness, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient dance, the forest breathing its eternal rhythm, and love, steady, enduring, transformative love, wrapping around two hearts that beat as one.